night is quiet now. Outside your window, the world has slowed to a whisper. The streets are still, the lights are soft, and somewhere far away, another day is folding itself into memory. Before you close your eyes, let me take you on a journey across centuries, across empires, across the fragile edge between life and legend. These are the moments before the end. Stories of people who stood their ground, whispered their last words, or simply looked toward the light one final time. Some were kings, some warriors, some dreamers, and some just ordinary souls who left behind something extraordinary. So take a breath. Let the noise of the day fade away. Let your mind drift through the quiet spaces of history, where every heartbeat echoes like a star at the edge of the universe. Because in these stories, you'll find not endings, but reflections of what it means to live, to hope, and to rest. Close your eyes, listen, and remember, even at the end, there is always beauty. It was the 12th century in Japan, and the night was heavy with fog. A tall monk named Benkei walked through the narrow streets of Kyoto, his shadow stretching like a giant against the lantern light. At 6 feet 6 inches, he looked more like a warrior than a holy man. And in truth, that was exactly what he was. Slung across his shoulder was a weapon longer than a man, half sword and half spear, called a naginata. In his eyes burned a fire that no temple could calm. Benkei was no ordinary monk. He was a Sohei, a warrior of the temple, trained in both scripture and battle. For years he had roamed the country challenging samurai, convinced that their arrogance was poisoning the soul of Japan. Every duel ended with a fallen opponent and a new sword on his back. He had taken 999 of them. One more, and his collection would be complete. On that final night, he hunted for the 1,000th blade, not knowing that fate was hunting him as well. Near the Gojo Bridge, he heard a flute. The sound was soft, beautiful, and strangely seductive. Following it, he found a small maid dressed in elegant robes, a katana shining at his waist. Benkei laughed. This frail musician was to be his final kill. He challenged him on the spot, confident the duel would end in seconds. The small man accepted without fear. They faced each other under the moon. The moment Benkei charged, steel flashed like lightning. Within heartbeats, Benkei's naginata lay on the ground, and his body fell to one knee. The musician stood calm, his sword untouched by blood. He bowed slightly, turned, and walked away. Days later, humiliation still burned inside Benkei. How could he, the slayer of hundreds, fall to someone so small? Rage turned to curiosity to respect. He sought the man again, and found him at Kiyomizu Temple. This time instead of a duel, Benkei knelt. He declared that he would follow the man until death. The warrior accepted. His name was Minamoto no Yoshitsune, prince of the Minamoto clan, destined to become a legend. From that day, Benkei served him as his shield, his sword, and his most loyal friend. For years they fought together through the Genpei War, carving their place into history. Yoshitsune's brilliance and Benkei's strength made them unstoppable. When the Minamoto clan finally triumphed, Yoshitsune's half-brother, Yoritomo, claimed the title of shogun. But victory bred jealousy. Soon the brothers turned against each other, and Yoshitsune became a fugitive. Benkei followed without hesitation. They found refuge in the north, under the protection of the Fujiwara clan. For a time, peace returned. But politics, like the tide, always changes. Bribes and threats persuaded their hosts to betray them. In June of 1189, the soldiers of Fujiwara surrounded the castle of Koromogawa. 500 men faced 5,000. Inside the walls, Yoshitsune knew the end had come. He prepared for seppuku, the ritual suicide that would preserve his honor. But first he needed time. He looked to Benkei, and Benkei understood. Without a word, he walked to the narrow bridge that led to the gate and stood there alone. The army charge urged. Wave after wave of soldiers rushed the bridge, and every man who set foot on it met death. Benkei's naginata swept through armor and bone alike. Arrows flew, spears broke, the bridge turned red beneath him. But he did not fall. He fought not for victory, but for moments, for seconds, enough for his master to die so as a samurai should. The attackers hesitated, whispers spreading that the monk was not human. Fear paralyzed them more than his blade did. From a distance, archers drew their bows. Arrows pierced his body one after another. His robe darkened, his breath slowed. Yet he did not move. Another volley struck, then another. He remained upright, still as a statue, his weapon planted before him. No one dared to cross. Minutes stretched into hours. Finally, Fujiwara's men crept forward, trembling. When they reached him, they realized the truth. Benkei was already dead. His body, held upright by the shaft of his own spear, had never fallen. Even in death, he guarded the bridge. Inside the castle, Yoshitsune completed his final ritual. His blade found its place, and he met death with calm. Outside, the enemy looked upon the monk who would not bow, the man who turned his dying breath into a wall, stronger than any fortress. That night, the wind moved through the bridge like a whisper, carrying Benkei's name through the centuries. They called it the standing death of Benkei, a tale of loyalty so fierce that even death had to wait. The sea was dark that morning off the coast of Korea. Mist drifted low across the water, hiding 13 lonely ships. On the deck of the flagship stood Admiral Yi Sun-sin, a man whose calm gaze could silence fear itself. The wind smelled of gunpowder and salt. His men waited for orders, knowing they faced an enemy 25 times their size. 300 Japanese warships were bearing down on them, filling the horizon like a wall of steel. But Yi Sun-sin did not move. He watched, he listened, and he smiled. He had been in worse battles, and he had never lost. Years earlier, when Japan first invaded Korea, the kingdom had been unprepared. Generals surrendered without a fight. Admirals sank their own ships rather than face defeat. Only one man refused to bow: Yi Sun-sin, a disciplined officer who believed that courage was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. Took command of a broken navy. His fleet was small, his supplies thin, his king suspicious of him. Yet in every battle, he turned the sea itself into a weapon. He studied the tides, the wind, and the enemy's pride. He made the impossible look effortless. He built ships unlike any seen before. Their hulls were covered with spikes to prevent boarding, their sides armed with cannons that could breathe fire. The Japanese called them monsters. The Koreans called them turtle ships. With these, Yi turned every encounter into a trap. He would let the enemy chase him into narrow straits, then surround them from behind with perfect timing. One by one, the enemy ships burned, while his own remained untouched. His victories spread like a legend. Even his enemies began to whisper his name with respect. But glory is dangerous. Jealous officials whispered to the king that Yi had grown too powerful. They accused him of treason, of arrogance, of disloyalty. The king, blinded by fear, believed them. Yi was stripped of rank, beaten, and thrown into prison. Tortured and humiliated, he was almost executed. Yet when disaster struck again, when Japan's second invasion crushed the navy, the same king begged for his return. Yi accepted, not for flattery or revenge, but because his country needed him. When he took command again, only 13 ships remained. Now, on that misty morning in 1597, he faced the enemy once more. His captains trembled. Some wept. Yi stood tall and said, "If you fight with all your heart, even 13 ships can destroy hundreds." His voice carried across the waves like thunder. The men shouted, their fear burning into resolve. As the enemy fleet advanced, Yi ordered the drums to sound. The rhythm echoed through the sea. His formation was perfect, his timing precise. One by one, Japanese ships fell into his trap, colliding in the narrow channel. Cannon fire roared. The water turned to smoke and flame. When the mist cleared, 31 enemy ships were gone. Yi had not lost a single man. The legend grew, battle after battle. He commanded victory with impossible calm. But wars end not in triumph, but in silence. In 1598, the final clash came at Noryang Strait. Yi led the Allied Korean and Chinese fleets against the retreating Japanese. The night sky burned red. Yi stood at the bow of his ship, beating the war drum himself. His son and nephew stood beside him. "Drive them back," he shouted. "Let no enemy pass." Cannon fire thundered. Enemy ships crumbled. Victory was within reach. Then a musket ball struck him under the arm. Yi staggered, blood darkening his armor. He knew the wound was fatal. Turning to his son and nephew, he whispered, "The war is at its height. Do not announce my death. Wear my armor. Beat the drum." They obeyed instantly. His nephew donned Yi's armor and returned to the deck, continuing the rhythm that had carried them through every battle. The fleet fought on, unaware that their admiral had fallen. By dawn, the sea was theirs. The Japanese fleet was gone. Below deck, Yi lay still, listening to the drum that beat above him. Each strike echoed through his fading heartbeat. He had done what he promised. Korea was safe. His fleet remained undefeated. He closed his eyes and let the rhythm carry him home. The waves outside whispered his final victory, one earned not through luck or numbers, but through discipline, loyalty, and unshakable resolve. He had lived without fear, fought without arrogance, and died without defeat. Centuries later, Koreans still call him the guardian of the seas. His statue stands in Seoul, facing the horizon he once defended. They say the ocean still remembers his name, and when storms rise, it beats like a drum. As if Admiral Yi himself is calling his men to battle again. The summer of 1944 was a nightmare carved into the Pacific. On the island of Saipan, the air itself felt heavy with death. Explosions shook the ground, trees burned, and the sea turned crimson near the shore. In the middle of this chaos stood a man who was never supposed to be here. His name was Captain Ben L. Solomon. By trade, he was a dentist. By heart, he was a soldier who refused to let his men die alone. Ben Solomon had been drafted into the United States Army just 4 years earlier. He was bright, disciplined, and calm under pressure, the kind of man who could make anyone trust him. After earning his degree from the University of Southern California Dental School, he joined the Army's Medical Corps. His job was to heal, not to kill. But war rarely respects job titles. In June of 1944, he landed on Saipan with the 105th Infantry Regiment, expecting to treat cavities and broken jaws. Instead, he found himself in the middle of one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific. The Japanese defenders refused to surrender. Every hill and cave became a fortress. American casualties mounted faster than medics could count. When the regimental surgeon was wounded, Solomon volunteered to replace him on the front line. His medical tent was just 50 yards behind the foxholes. For days, he worked without rest, stitching, bandaging, giving morphine, and whispering comfort to men whose names he would never know. Outside, machine guns rattled without pause. The sound of dying was constant. At dawn on July 7th, The Japanese launched their final attack. 4,000 soldiers charged in what would later be called a banzai assault, a human wave meant to overwhelm everything in its path. Within minutes, the front lines collapsed. The wounded poured into Solomon's tent. He moved from man to man, ignoring the chaos outside. Then he looked up and saw a nightmare. A Japanese soldier had broken through the perimeter and was stabbing a wounded American lying just outside. Solomon grabbed a rifle from a nearby stretcher, aimed, and fired once. The attacker fell. But more shadows were already moving through the smoke. 2 more enemy soldiers rushed in from the entrance. Solomon shot one, bayoneted the other. Then 4 more crawled under the tent walls. He struck 2 down with his rifle, jabbed another in the throat, and crushed the last one with the butt of his gun. He yelled for the medics to evacuate the wounded. "Go," he said, "I'll hold them off." They hesitated, but one look at his face told them he meant it. The wounded began crawling toward safety, while Ben turned back to the opening, the sound of boots and screams closing in. When the medics looked back from the jungle, the tent was already surrounded. Moments later, a burst of machine gun fire erupted from inside. It was Solomon. He had taken control of a Browning heavy machine gun, a weapon meant for 2 men. Alone, he swept the charging enemy with bursts of fire. Dozens fell, then hundreds. He shifted the gun from window to window, refusing to let them through. Witnesses said his firing never stopped for nearly 15 minutes. When the battle finally ended, the island was silent again. Days later, when American reinforcements reached the position, they found a scene that defied belief. The field surgeon who had once fixed teeth was now slumped over the smoking machine gun, his body riddled with bullets and bayonet wounds. In front of him lay nearly 100 dead Japanese soldiers. Behind him, the wounded men he had protected were gone, evacuated to safety. He had stayed behind to buy them time, and he had succeeded. For decades, his story was little more than a rumor. The Geneva Convention forbade medics from bearing arms, and technicalities delayed his recognition. It was not until 2002, almost 60 years later, that Captain Ben L. Solomon was finally awarded the Medal of Honor. By then, everyone who had known him was gone, but his courage had outlived them all. Ben Solomon never sought glory. He did not charge into battle for medals or fame. He was a healer who chose to fight only when there was no one else left to stand. On that island, he became something more than a soldier. He became the last wall between life and oblivion. In the quiet that followed the battle, the waves of Saipan washed over the shore, whispering the story of a man who had every reason to run and chose instead to stand his ground. A dentist, a doctor, a warrior, and a legend. The sun rose over the narrow pass of Thermopylae, and with it came the end of Anwar's patience. The Persian army stretched as far as the eye could see, a tide of men and horses shimmering under the morning light. 300 Spartans stood waiting, their shields locked, their spears pointed forward, their king at the center. Leonidas, son of Anaxandridas, faced the horizon with a calm that made his soldiers believe that perhaps death was not something to fear, but something to meet with pride. For days, they had held the pass against the greatest army the world had ever seen. Every attack had broken against them, like waves against rock. The narrow cliffs and the sea forced the Persians to fight man to man, and in that space, the Spartans were gods. Leonidas fought in the front line, his armor scratched, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. Each time he lifted his spear, another enemy fell. Around him, his men laughed, taunted the enemy, and fought with the joy of those who knew exactly what their deaths would mean. The Persians came in endless waves, driven by whips and the will of their king Xerxes. Arrows darkened the sky, shields shattered. But the Spartan line did not break. Even when neighboring allies began to retreat, Leonidas refused. He told his men that courage was not about surviving, but about choosing how to die. That night, as they gathered around small fires, he spoke quietly to his captains. "Tomorrow we dine in Hades," he said, smiling. "But tonight, we eat like kings." At dawn, a traitor revealed a hidden mountain path, allowing the Persians to surround the Spartan position. When Leonidas learned of this betrayal, there was no anger in his eyes. He knew what it meant. The battle was lost, but the war could still be won. He dismissed most of the Allied troops, sending them away to live and fight another day. Only his 300 remained, joined by a few hundred Thespians and Thebans who refused to abandon them. They polished their armor, fixed their broken shields, and waited. As the Persian army closed in from both sides, Leonidas stepped forward. The air trembled with the roar of thousands. He turned to his men and said, "Spartans, remember this day. It will echo through eternity." The line moved forward, a wall of bronze and muscle. The impact was thunder. Spears broke, swords clashed. Blood mixed with sand. They fought like men already dead, fearless and relentless. The Persians expected surrender. Instead, they found immortality forged in flesh and iron. Leonidas was everywhere at once, his presence a force of nature. When his spear shattered, he drew his sword. When his sword broke, he fought with his sons. Arrows pierced his armor, but he kept moving. He laughed as he killed, as if mocking death itself. His men followed his rhythm, their voices rising in chants. "Molon lady," they shouted, "come eat and take them." When Leonidas finally fell, it was not from fear or exhaustion, but from inevitability. Surrounded and bleeding, he looked toward the sea, where the sun was rising again. He smiled, because he knew that Sparta would remember. After his death, the Persians demanded that his body be returned. His men refused. They fought over it like lions protecting their cubs, until every last Spartan lay dead. The Persians, awed by what they had seen, buried Leonidas with honor. His defiance had bought the Greeks precious time to unite, and within a year, they would drive the invaders back into the sea. Centuries later, the name Leonidas still stands as a symbol of courage. At Thermopylae, there is a monument that bears a single inscription. It reads, "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." The stone faces east, toward the rising sun, just as Leonidas did. And when the wind moves through the narrow pass, it sounds almost like laughter, a king's laughter, echoing through eternity, defying death itself. The summer sun hung heavy over Alexandria, turning marble palaces into mirrors of fire. Inside the royal chambers, the scent of incense clung to the air, masking the stench of war. Cleopatra, last queen of Egypt, stood before a bronze mirror, her crown glinting like a dying star. Outside, the sounds of marching echoed through the streets. The city that had once been hers was now crawling with Roman soldiers. Her empire was gone, her armies broken, her lover dead. But her pride remained unbudged. She would not live to be paraded in chains. Cleopatra had been born into power, but her life had been nothing but war. She had seduced kings, outwitted generals, and ruled through intellect sharper than any blade. For years she had fought to keep Egypt free from Rome's shadow, first with Julius Caesar, then with Mark Antony. She played a game of survival that only she could win. But games end, and so do empires. When Antony fell on his sword after the defeat at Actium, the world called it the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Cleopatra knew better. It was only the beginning of her final act. In the courtyard below, Octavian's banners flapped in the wind. The conqueror of Rome was marching to claim his trophy. He wanted Cleopatra alive, to humiliate her before the Senate, to strip Egypt of its last queen and turn her into a symbol of submission. She imagined herself dragged through Roman streets, bound in golden chains, her children forced to watch. The thought filled her not with fear, but disgust. Power, she had learned, was not about crowns or armies. It was about control. And she still had control over her ending. She summoned her most loyal servants, Iris and Charmian. Together they sealed the palace doors. From a hidden chamber, they brought out a small basket draped in linen. Inside, coiled a single asp, sacred to the goddess Isis. Cleopatra looked at the serpent, calm and beautiful, its scales reflecting the sunlight like liquid gold. Death, she thought, had rarely appeared so elegant. She turned to her mirror one last time. The woman who stared back was not the girl who had seduced Caesar, nor the empress who ruled beside Antony. This was the true queen of Egypt, tired, defiant, and free. She removed her crown and placed it on a brazier burning beside the throne. The gold softened, then melted, dripping like tears onto the floor. "Let Rome have the ashes," she whispered. Iris trembled as Cleopatra lifted the snake. Its fangs brushed her skin. The bite was almost gentle. A moment later, a chill spread through her body. Her legs weakened, her breath slowed. She reclined on the couch, the silk rustling like waves on the Nile. "So it ends," she murmured, her voice fading into the heat. Iris and Charmian followed her soon after, loyal even in death. When Octavian entered the chamber, he found her lying in silence, dressed in royal white, her expression serene. The serpent coiled at her feet like a guardian. For a moment, even the Roman conqueror felt something close to awe. Cleopatra had denied him his victory. She had chosen her own ending, robbing Rome of its spectacle. There would be no parade, no humiliation, no broken queen begging for mercy. Only legend. In the centuries that followed, her story became myth, her name synonymous with beauty, ambition, and defiance. Artists painted her as a goddess, poets sang of her as a lover. But those who understood power remembered her differently. They saw a woman who understood that dying on her own terms was the ultimate act of sovereignty. Her throne was gone, her kingdom dust, yet her will remained unbroken. On the banks of the Nile, where the river bends toward the sea, the reeds still whisper her name when the wind is hot and the water low. They say the queen who burned her crown did not die in despair, but in triumph. Because even in death, Cleopatra ruled her destiny. In the quiet of a Tokyo morning in 1970, the sky was sharp and cold. From the balcony of the Self-Defense Force headquarters, a man stood before the soldiers below. His name was Yukio Mishima, one of Japan's most celebrated writers and one of its most controversial sons. He was dressed not in a suit, but in the uniform of an imperial soldier, his sword glinting at his side. The soldiers watched him in confusion. To them, he was a novelist, not a warrior. But today Mishima had come to remind Japan of what he believed it had forgotten: honor, discipline, and the spirit of sacrifice. For years he had lived between two worlds. On paper, he was a genius. His novels were poetic, violent, filled with beauty and fondant. He wrote about men torn between duty and desire, about bodies sculpted like temples, about a Japan that no longer existed. But off the page, he trained his body like a soldier, lifting weights, fencing, and mastering kendo. He believed that words without action were hollow. In his eyes, modern Japan had traded its soul for comfort, its pride for peace. To Mishima, that was a slow kind of death, and he refused to die slowly. So he formed a private militia, the Shield Society, a small group of young men devoted to restoring the spirit of the samurai. They wore uniforms, trained with swords, and swore loyalty not to the government, but to the emperor. Many mocked them as play actors, delusional patriots. Mishima didn't care. He believed that beauty and tragedy were inseparable. To live beautifully, he said, one must be prepared to die beautifully. Every book he wrote, every speech he gave, moved closer to one inevitable conclusion. On the morning of November 25th, he arrived at the military base under the pretense of giving a speech. He and 4 followers entered the office of the commander, tied him up, and barricaded the doors. Then Mishima walked out onto the balcony overlooking the courtyard. The soldiers below stared in disbelief as he began to speak. His voice was calm, his words sharp as his blade. He told them that Japan had become hollow, that its people had forgotten the meaning of honor, that the emperor's divine essence had been betrayed. He called on them to race, to reclaim their pride. The wind carried his words across the yard, but the soldiers only laughed. They thought it was theater. They thought it was madness. When he realized no one would follow him, Mishima nodded once, almost as if he had expected it. He turned, walked back inside, and closed the doors. His followers knelt in silence. Mishima removed his jacket, folded it neatly, and placed his sword before him. He looked around the room one last time, his expression serene. "A life without honor is not life," he said softly. Then, with ritual precision, he performed seppuku, the ancient act of cutting open the belly to release the bull. His companion, Morita, knelt beside him trembling and carried out the final strike that ended his suffering. Outside, the laughter had stopped. The soldiers stood in stunned silence. The smell of incense drifted through the air. The man they had mocked lay dead by his own hand, his uniform spotless, his body still upright. He had turned his death into art, his final gesture into a living poem. Reporters would later call it a political stunt, a tragedy, or insanity. But those who had read his words knew it was something else entirely. It was the closing line of a story he had been writing his whole life. In his home, his manuscripts remained neatly stacked on the desk. His last piece of writing was a story titled The Decay of the Angel. Its final words spoke of a man seeking purity in a corrupt world. Mishima had found his own purity in the only way he believed was left to him. The body was the last expression of beauty, and death to him was the ultimate form of control. Decades later, Japan would remember him not just as a writer or a soldier, but as a paradox. He loved the modern world, yet longed for the past. He was both artist and warrior, lover and executioner, dreamer and destroyer. His death shocked a nation, but his words still breathe in the hearts of those who understand what it means to live for an idea too vast for survival. The poet who died by his own sword left behind not despair, but a question: how much of yourself are you willing to give to the truth you believe in? The answer still echoes, carried by the wind over Tokyo, where the samurai poet found beauty not in living forever, but in dying completely. The walls of Luoyang shook under the thunder of approaching armies. Smoke rose from the east as the Tang banners burned in the distance. Inside the city, the great General Guo Ziyi stood in the courtyard of his home, calm despite the sound of chaos outside. He was old now, his beard streaked with gray, his armor worn from decades of war. Servants begged him to leave while there was still time, but he simply looked toward the setting sun and said, "A soldier does not run from his own gate." It had been a lifetime of loyalty. Guozi had fought for emperors who came and went, had crushed rebellions, and defended the empire from foreign invaders. Once, his name alone was enough to rally tens of thousands. But power shifts like sand in a storm. The Anlushan rebellion had torn China apart, and in its wake, paranoia ruled the court. Jealous ministers whispered in the emperor's ear, accusing Guo of treason. He had more soldiers than anyone, they said. He had too much loyalty from the people. Even victory, in times like these, could look like a threat. Guo was summoned to the capital under false pretenses. His friends warned him not to go, that it was a trap, that he would never return. He smiled and said, "If my heart is clean, why should I fear the palace?" When he arrived, the emperor greeted him with cold courtesy. The accusations were read aloud, the ministers waiting like vultures. Guo knelt and removed his sword, placing it before the throne. "Your Majesty," he said, "this blade has served you faithfully for 40 years. If it has become a danger, then let it be taken now." His honesty disarmed them all. The emperor, ashamed, stood and helped him to his feet. For a moment, loyalty triumphed over suspicion. But the empire was dying. The frontiers collapsed. Rebellions fired, and the Mongol tribes began to push south. Guo was called from retirement once more to defend the borders. His body ached, but his spirit was unbroken. He gathered what troops he could and marched north. At every town he passed, people bowed in silence. They knew this was not just another campaign. It was a farewell. When the enemy finally reached the gates of Luoyang, there were too few soldiers left to mount a defense. The court had fled west, abandoning the city to its fate. Only Guo and a handful of men remained. His officers begged him to retreat, to save himself for another day. He refused. "If the general runs, who will stay? If I die here, then at least the people will know that the Tang still has one loyal heart." As the invaders approached, Guo ordered the gates opened. His soldiers panicked, thinking he had surrendered. But he simply stood at the entrance, dressed in full armor, his banner raised high. The enemy commander, seeing the legendary general alone and unarmed, hesitated. This was the man who had crushed rebellions, who had spared enemies, who had built peace from chaos. He ordered his men to halt. Guo walked forward, bowed and said, "If you have come for gold, there is none. If you have come for vengeance, I am here. But know that killing one old man will not bring you glory." There was a long silence. Then slowly the enemy lowered their weapons. They withdrew from the city without a single strike. The people of Luoyang would later say, it was not words or power that saved them, but dignity. Guo Ziyi died soon after, in his sleep at peace. He had seen empires rise and fall, emperors crowned and buried, and yet he had never lost himself. His loyalty had outlasted politics. His courage had outlasted war. Centuries later, his story was still told to young soldiers across China, not as a tale of conquest, but of restraint. The general who refused to flee had proved that true strength is not found in the sword, but in the will to stand when everyone else runs. The stones of Luoyang still carry his name, carved into the gate he defended with nothing but his honor. And when the wind passes through those ancient walls, it whispers the same vow he once made. A soldier does not run from his own gate. The sky above Northumbria was gray and heavy with rain. In the muddy square of a Saxon village, a wooden pit had been dug, and in the center stood a man whose name still echoes through 1,000 sagas. Ragnar Lothbrok, the scourge of kings, the terror of the North Sea, had finally been captured, shackled and beaten. His face still carried the grin of a man who knew that legends do not kneel. Around him, English soldiers whispered in awe and fear. This was the Viking who had burned their towns, shattered their armies, and vanished into the mist only to return again and again. But today there would be no escape. King Ella had prepared a punishment meant to erase his name forever. What he did not know was that death was exactly what Ragnar wanted. Ragnar's journey had begun decades earlier, not as a king, but as a farmer, restless for adventure. He had sailed with a small crew across the unknown Western Sea, discovering lands no Norseman had seen before. His raids were brutal and brilliant. To his people, he was more than a warrior. He was proof that the gods still walked among men. His cunning rivaled Odin's, his courage matched Thor's. He defied kings, defied storms, and defied the very limits of the world. But age spares no one, not even legends. Betrayed and captured in a foreign land, Ragnar now faced a death reserved for monsters. King Ella wanted to make an example of him. The Viking prisoners were forced to dig the pit, their eyes downcast, afraid to meet Ragnar's gaze. The king stood above them, wrapped in furs, his voice trembling with both anger and priesthood. "You have slaughtered my people," he said. "Now your gods will see you broken." Ragnar lifted his head, chains rattling, and laughed. "My gods," he said, "are already waiting for me." The crowd fell silent. Even Ella hesitated. Ragnar's voice carried across the courtyard like thunder. "The piglets will squeal when they hear how the old boar died." That one line would outlive them all. The executioners brought out the pit, filled with writhing snakes. Ragnar looked down into it, at the mass of coiling bodies, and smiled wider. "It seems," he said, "that the sons of Odin will welcome me soon." The guards shoved him forward. He fell into the pit, chains clanging, the hiss of snakes filling the air. The first bite came quickly, then another and another. But the laughter never stopped. He laughed as the poison took hold, laughed as his vision blurred, laughed until the sound became one with the rain. The soldiers stepped back, unnerved. They had killed a man, but something greater remained standing in their minds, a spirit that refused to bow. Far away, across the sea, his sons, Bjorn Ironside, Ivar the Boneless, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, and Ubbi would hear of his death. They would so sail with fleets so vast that they blotted out the horizon, bringing vengeance to every shore. Towns burned, kings fell, and England trembled under the fury of Ragnar's blood. But even amid the storm of revenge, none of his sons could escape his shadow. He had turned his own death into the spark that lit an empire. For the Norse, death was never the end. It was a doorway, and Ragnar had walked through it laughing. The skalds, the storytellers of the North, would sing of that laughter for centuries. They would say that when thunder rolls across the sea, it is Ragnar laughing still, reminding the living that courage is louder than fear, and that no king can silence a man who meets death as an equal. Today historians argue over whether Ragnar was real or myth, a man or a mosaic of many warriors. But in truth, it does not matter. His story has outlived the bones of kingdoms. He became what every warrior dreamed to be: legend born of defiance, a soul that mocked the very idea of mortality. The Vikings did not build monuments for Ragnar. They did not need to. His monument is the sea itself, endless, cold and alive with the sound of laughter. And when the waves crash against the cliffs of England, those who listen closely swear they can still hear Thor's fearless laugh carried on the wind, the echo of the Viking who died as he lived, unbroken. The sky over Tokyo burned like a wound. Smoke twisted into the wind. The ground below swallowed by fire. Inside, a crippled bomber spiraling toward the city, a young Japanese pilot gripped the controls with trembling hands. His name was Lieutenant Haruto Tanaka, 23 years old, barely more than a boy. The gauges on his dashboard flickered red. The engine screamed. And somewhere behind him, his co-pilot was shouting for him to jump. The parachutes were still good. He could survive. But through the shattered glass of the cockpit, he saw the city below, thousands of roofs, thousands of lives, and he made a choice that would turn his death into salvation. Haruto had not wanted to die a martyr. He had joined the Imperial Navy out of duty, not fanaticism. His father was a fisherman from Nagasaki, his mother a teacher. They had raised him to believe that life was sacred, that even in war, honor meant protecting, not destroying. But as the war dragged on, The orders grew darker. In the final months, pilots were told they would fly one-way missions. Kamikaze. They called it the divine wind. Haruto listened as his commanders spoke of sacrifice and glory, of dying for the emperor, of crashing their planes into American ships. The other pilots cheered. He did not. He saluted, yes, but inside, he felt something crack. He had flown 6 missions, none returning. Each time he volunteered to guide the younger pilots. Each time, he came back because the weather or luck intervened. Each time, he told himself he could still serve without dying. But fate, like gravity, does not forgive hesitation. On the morning of March 9, 1945, Haruto's squadron took off into a red sunrise. The plan was simple: strike the American bombers before they reached Tokyo. The air was thick with smoke from earlier raids. They never saw the enemy until it was too late. An explosion rocked the wing of his plane. Shrapnel tore through the cockpit. The engines caught fire. His co-pilot screamed for him to bail out. Haruto unbuckled his harness, ready to leap, when he saw a line of houses directly below, right in the plane's descent path. If he jumped, the bomber would hit them squarely. Families, children, everyone. In a single breath, he saw his mother's face, her hands lighting incense before a family shrine. And he understood. He sat back down, grabbed the controls, and forced the plane toward the open sea. His co-pilot realized what he was doing. "Lieutenant, no. The ocean's too far." Haruto didn't answer. He pushed the throttle until the burning engine screamed in protest. The cabin filled with smoke. Heat clawed at his lungs, and his vision blurred. The coastline loomed below. The plane was falling apart, shaking violently, but he kept pulling, guiding it past the edge of the city. Below, people looked up to see a streak of flame hurtling toward the water. Some swore they saw the silhouette of a man in the cockpit, hands steady, head bowed as if in prayer. The bomber hit the waves miles offshore. The explosion sent up a tower of white spray, then nothing but smoke and silence. The newspapers never printed his name. His death was recorded as another pilot lost in battle. The official reports praised those who crashed into ships, not those who turned away. His family received a letter of condolence and a small medal. No one told them that his final act had saved hundreds. Years later, divers exploring the seabed off Tokyo Bay found the wreck. The fuselage was twisted but intact, the cockpit sealed. Inside, they found the remains of 2 men, still strapped in, the controls frozen in ice. On the pilot's seat, a small charm rested against the metallic wooden carving of a crane, a symbol of peace. The water had worn away its color, but the shape remained. Historians would later argue whether the story was true or embellished. But the villagers on the coast still tell it when the night is calm and the sea glows with moonlight. They say that sometimes, when the wind comes in from the east, you can hear the faint sound of engines and the cry of gulls, followed by silence. And if you stand on the cliffs and listen closely, you might hear the whisper of a young man's voice carried on the breeze, not the city, the sea. In a war where glory was measured by destruction, Lieutenant Haruto Tanaka chose compassion. He turned death into mercy. His final act was not one of submission, but defiance, the refusal to let innocence burn with the world. The pilot who stayed behind did not die for his emperor or his flag. He died for strangers he would never meet, and in doing so, reminded the world that even in war, humanity can still take the controls. The sun burned high above the Italian countryside, casting long shadows over the training grounds of Casefua. Dust rose with every strike, every scream, every drop of sweat. Among the hundreds of enslaved gladiators stood a man whose name would one day shake Rome itself, Spartacus. Once a soldier, now a thief, he had been chained, beaten, and forced to fight for the amusement of those who called themselves civilized. The crowd cheered for blood, and he gave it to them, but not for glory. Every swing of his sword was a promise. One day, the arena would belong to him. Spartacus had been captured during a campaign along the Thracian border. The Romans thought they could tame him, break him, and turn him into a spectacle. But a man who has already lost everything cannot be broken. He can only be waiting. In the barracks at night, he whispered to the other Zulus, Syrians, Africans, men from every corner of the empire. We fight their battles, he said, and they call us beasts. But a beast who knows freedom is stronger than any master. His words spread like sparks in dry grass. One summer night, when the guards grew drunk, Spartacus made his move. With a handful of kitchen knives and stolen swords, he led 70 gladiators out of the school and into the hills. The revolt began with desperation, but grew with purpose. Slaves from nearby farms joined them, then shepherds, then runaway soldiers. Within months, the hills of southern Italy burned with rebellion. The Senate laughed at first. Then they sent soldiers and lost. Again and again, they underestimated him. Spartacus did not fight like a Roman general. He fought like a man who had nothing left to lose. He taught his followers to fight in small units, to strike fast, to vanish before the legions could regroup. They built camps, forged weapons, and for the first time in their lives, chose their own leaders. Women fought beside men. The weak were protected. They called each other brother and sister, not soy. What began as an escape had become an army, and its commander was no longer a gladiator, he was a symbol. To the Romans, he was a monster. To the enslaved, he was freedom itself. For 2 years, his army carved a scar across the empire. Rome sent its finest generals, and Spartacus defeated them all. His strategy was brilliant, his discipline unmatched. He could have marched on Rome itself, and for a time he considered it. But his goal was not conquest, it was escape. He wanted ships to take his people home. Yet betrayal has a way of finding those who defy empires. The pirates he paid for transport abandoned him, taking the gold and leaving him trapped in the south, surrounded by the legions of Marcus Crassus. The final battle came near the river Salaris. Rain turned the field to mud, the air thick with smoke. Spartacus rode before his men, his armor dented, his face streaked with blood and ash. He raised his sword and shouted, "If we must die, let it be as free men, not as slaves." The army roared back, a chorus of the damned, and charged. They broke through the first Roman line, then the second. Spartacus cut down every soldier in his path, driving straight for Crassus himself. But a spear found him before he reached his target. He fell to his knees, still swinging his blade until his last breath. When it was over, thousands lay dead on both sides. The Romans searched for his body, but they never found it. In death, Spartacus became what he could never be in life, a myth too powerful to chain. Rome crucified 6,000 of his followers along the Appian Way, lining the road with bodies as a warning. But even as they hung there, the legend spread. Mothers whispered his name to their children. Poets turned his story into prophecy. Every summer that followed Rome would fear the same thing. The moment the oppressed remember, they outnumber the masters. Centuries later, revolutions would rise and fall in his name. His image would be carved into stone, printed on flags, sung in anthems. He became the eternal symbol of defiance, the slave who looked an empire in the eye and dared to say no. They say that when the wind moves through the fields of Italy, the grass bends in waves, like the ranks of a forgotten army. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear it, the clash of swords, the cry for freedom, and the voice of a man who died standing, whispering the only truth that ever mattered. We are free. The air in the Roman camp was heavy with the scent of parchment and oil lamps. A single candle burned beside the bed of a dying emperor. Marcus Aurelius, philosopher, warrior, and ruler of the known world, lay beneath the weight of both crown and conscience. Outside, the Danube River whispered against the frozen banks, where his legions waited for orders that would never come. Inside the tent, his hand trembled as he wrote his final letter, not to a senator, not to a general, but to his son. He had ruled Rome for nearly 2 decades, leading armies across mountains, enduring plague, betrayal, and endless war. Yet what tormented him most was not the enemy beyond the frontier, but the corruption within his own heart. He had written thousands of pages in his private journal, meditations meant only for himself, reminders to remain calm, to act justly, to remember that all men, even emperors, are mortal. But the ink on those pages could not stop the decay of his body, nor the ambitions of those who waited for his death. His son, Commodus, was young, beautiful, and reckless. Marcus had spent years trying to guide him toward wisdom, to teach him that power without virtue was poison. But the boy preferred games to philosophy, gladiators to generals, pleasure to discipline. Now, as fever consumed the emperor's mind, he knew that his death would unleash chaos. Yet he wrote anyway, because a father's duty is to hope, even when hope is foolish. The letter began simply, "To my son, remember that the throne is not a gift, but a burden." His hand moved slowly across the page. "The gods will not favor you because of your birth, only because of your deeds. Rule yourself before you try to rule the world. Let mercy guide your hand and reason your sword. Remember that throughout is voice, but virtue is music, and only one endures." He paused, listening to the wind against the canvas walls, and smiled faintly. "And if someday you forget all this, open this letter and read it again. A father can be wrong, but the universe never lies." When the last word was written, he folded the parchment and sealed it with wax. He placed it on the table beside his bed, next to a small bronze statue of a Stoic philosopher, its face calm and unyielding. Outside, the sound of horses and distant voices faded into silence. Marcus looked toward the entrance of the tent, where the light of dawn was beginning to creep through. "So it ends," he murmured, "as all things must." He closed his eyes, his breath slowing. In that moment, he was not an emperor or a god, but a man at peace with the order of the universe. His thoughts drifted to the principles he had lived by: control, humility, and the acceptance of fate. Death to him was not an enemy, but a natural part of the design. Everything we see, he had written once, is in constant change, and every moment dies into the next. Now he felt that truth in his bones. When the soldiers entered later that morning, they found him still and serene, his face turned toward the light. The letter remained untouched, sealed with the mark of an eagle. It would never reach his son. Commodus would burn the words unread, and his reign would become a reign of terror. The Rome that Marcus had built through reason would crumble into madness. Yet history, like time, is patient. The empire would forget the son, but never the father. Centuries later, fragments of his writings would resurface: his meditations, his letters, his reminders to himself and to humanity. They would be copied, translated, studied by kings, soldiers, and philosophers. His words would outlive marble, monuments, and armies. "Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be," he had once written. "Be one." Some say the wind that passes over the Danube still carries his last words, though no one ever heard them aloud. But perhaps that was his intention. Marcus Aurelius had lived not to be remembered, but to understand. And when death finally came, it found him unafraid, his pen still warm, his duty complete. The emperor's last letter was not written to his son, It was written to all of us. The night of April 26, 1986, began like any other in the small Ukrainian town of Pripyat. The people slept. The river flowed quietly past the forests. And inside Reactor 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, a group of engineers prepared for what was supposed to be a routine safety test. But within minutes, the test would become the greatest technological disaster in human history. When the reactor exploded at 1:23 in the morning, the Earth itself seemed to cry out. The blast ripped through concrete and steel, hurling pieces of graphite into the sky like black snow. In the chaos that followed, there was one man who refused to run. His name was Valery Kotemchuk, and he was the first to die. But there was another, Dr. Anatoly Sitnikov, who stayed. Dr. Sitnikov was the deputy chief physicist at the plant. He was not supposed to be there that night. When the explosion occurred, he was asleep in his apartment. A phone call woke him. "The reactor's gone," the voice said. He did not believe it. Reactors do not simply vanish. He dressed quickly, drove through the deserted streets, and reached the plant just before dawn. What he found defied logic. The building was split open, flames licking the air, the roof gone. Men in torn uniforms stumbled through the yard, faces blistered, hair falling out in clumps. They were trying to fight a fire that was no longer a fire, but a star. The radiation was invisible, but it was everywhere. Sitnikov ordered the men back, but they refused. He climbed the ladder to the roof himself. The dosimeter in his pocket clicked violently, then stopped. It had reached its maximum reading. He stood at the edge of the ruined reactor, staring into the glowing crater where the core once stood. The light was an impossible blue, beautiful and deadly. He knew what it meant. The graphite had ignited. The reactor was open to the world. He stayed long enough to understand the scale of it, long enough to report what needed to be done. Then he came down, coughing, his skin already burning. When the firemen were dying in the hospital, Sitnikov was with them. He helped record symptoms, documented exposure, tried to comfort men whose bodies were dissolving from within. The other scientists urged him to leave for Moscow, to save himself, to tell the story to the party. He refused. "I will stay until the reactor is contained," he said. "If we leave now, no one will know what to do next." He kept working as the helicopters came and went, dropping sand and boron onto the ruins. He drew maps of radiation levels, sketched plans for containment, and advised the engineers sealing the tunnels. He did not wear protective gear. There was none strong enough. His hair turned white in days. He bled from his gums. But still, he stayed. By May, his body began to fail. He was taken to a hospital in Moscow, barely conscious, his skin gray, his veins black. Before slipping into a coma, he asked for a notebook. With trembling hands, he wrote a final message for the team still at Chernobyl. "Do not be afraid. Measure everything. Record everything. The truth will save more lives than lies ever could." He died soon after, his name buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and secrecy. For decades, almost no one spoke of him. He had no medals, no statues, no recognition, only the gratitude of those who lived because he chose not to run. Years later, declassified documents revealed that his early measurements had allowed Soviet engineers to predict the spread of radiation and prevent a second explosion that could have destroyed half of Europe. His actions, quiet and unseen, saved millions. But in the official records, he remained a footnote, a doctor who stayed too long. Today, the ruins of Chernobyl stand silent, consumed by forests and ghosts. The air hums faintly with the memory of that night. In the control room, where lights once blinked and voices once shouted, everything is still. And yet, if you listen closely, You can almost hear the scratch of a pen against paper, the voice of a man refusing to look away. Dr. Anatoly Sitnikov never called himself a hero. He simply did his duty. But in a world built on denial, duty can be the bravest act of all. The man who stayed behind in the shadow of an invisible death did not save himself, but he saved us all. His courage lives not in monuments, but in every story that chooses truth over silence. The desert sun rose over Amarna, washing the sand out. In the heart of Egypt's most mysterious city, a lone statue of a pharaoh gazed toward the horizon, its face weathered but serene. His name was Akhenaten, the heretic king, the man who defied the gods and tried to reshape the soul of a civilization. For 17 years, he ruled the mightiest empire on earth. Then, as suddenly as he appeared, he vanished. His statues were destroyed, his name erased, his tomb lost. It was as if history itself had conspired to forget him. But some names refused to die. Before Akhenaten, Egypt had been a land of 1,000 gods. Every city had its patron deity, every priest his own temple. The gods ruled through the pharaohs, and the priests ruled through fear. Then came the young prince Amenhotep, who would later rename himself Akhenaten, the one who serves Aten, the sun disk. He rejected the old gods, declaring that there was only one, the sun itself, giver of life to all. To his people, it was heresy. To him, it was revelation. He built a new city in the desert, far from the temples of Thebes, and called it Akhetaten, the horizon of the sun. There, he raised altars open to the sky, so that the rays of Aten could touch the offerings directly. There were no walls, no shadows, no idols. For the first time in history, a pharaoh had declared that the divine was not many, but one. The priests of Amun, stripped of power and wealth, seethed in silence. The common people, bewildered, followed their king, because that was what Egyptians did. But in the quiet corners of the old temples, rebellion began to take root. Akhenaten's reign was one of contradictions. He closed the temples of the old gods, but filled his new city with art and beauty. His queen, Nefertiti, ruled beside him as an equal, her image carved beside his, in stone. The royal family was portrayed with affection, their daughters playing at their feet, a tenderness unseen in Egyptian art before or since. Yet while the court flourished in the sunlight of Aten, the rest of Egypt starved in the shadows. Famine spread, foreign allies rebelled, and the empire that had stood for 1,000 years began to crack. When Akhenaten died, no one knows, his name was struck from every monument. His city was abandoned, his temples torn down, his statues demolished. The priests reclaimed their power, restoring the old gods and burying his revolution beneath centuries of silence. His son, Tutankhaten, was renamed Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun. The worship of Aten was outlawed. To the priests, it was as if Akhenaten had never existed. But the desert remembers. In the ruins of Amarna, archaeologists found fragments of letters written by foreign kings, pleading for help from a pharaoh who never answered. They found art so different, so human, that it seemed to come from another world. And they found hymns carved into stone that spoke of one God, one light, one truth, a vision that would echo millennia later in other lands, in other faiths. The man they called heretic may have been the first monotheist in history. Even in death, Akhenaten remained elusive. His tomb was never found, though some say his bones lie hidden among those of the unnamed mummies in the Valley of the Kings. Others believe his body was destroyed, his spirit condemned to wander between the stars he once worshipped. But perhaps that is what he wanted. In his hymns, he wrote that the soul returns to the sun, becoming one with its light. When I rise in you, he wrote, I am forever reborn. Centuries later, when the archaeologists uncovered his name again, they could not decide whether he was a prophet or a madman. But they all agreed on one thing: he had seen farther than his time allowed. The king who vanished had dared to dream of eternity not as a god to be feared, but as a light to be understood. Today, as the sun sets over the Nile, its rays still fall upon the ruins of Amarna, touching the stones that once echoed with prayers to Aten. The priests are gone. The empire is dust. But the sunlight remains, the same light Akhenaten worshipped, the same light that touches us all. And in that golden silence, his voice still whispers through the ages. The sun is enough. The wind from the Aegean carried the smell of salt and ash over the ruins of Sparta. The city that had once ruled through fear and discipline was silent now, its walls cracked, its streets overgrown. But long before silence fell, there was a woman who spoke for its spirit. Her name was Gorgo, daughter of a king, wife of Leonidas, and the last true voice of Sparta. When her husband marched to Thermopylae, she did not weep. When word came of his death, she did not scream. She simply stood, straight-backed and unflinching, because she knew what it meant to be Spartan. From the moment she was born, Gorgo was raised not as an ornament, but as an equal. In a world where women were silenced, Spartan girls learned to speak, to think, to run, to fight. They owned land, chose their husbands, and commanded respect. Gorgo was sharper than most men in the court, and even as a child she understood politics as well as war. When the Persian envoys came to demand tribute, offering gold in exchange for obedience, she was the one who whispered to her father, "Father, you should be careful with this man, or he will corrupt you." The court laughed. Then they realized she was right. Years later, when Leonidas became king, she stood beside him as both partner and a counselor. It was she who urged him to take the 300, knowing he would never return. "Come back with your shield," she said, "or on it." Those words, harsh to outsiders, were not cruelty but love, the kind of love that demanded honor over life. She watched him leave without tears, for to weep before the battle was to dishonor the cause. When the messengers came weeks later, carrying news of his death and the annihilation of his army, the women of Sparta gathered in silence. They looked to Gorgo. She raised her head and said, "Spartans, you are the mothers of heroes. Do not mourn. Teach your sons to be like their fathers." In that moment, the legacy of Sparta passed from the spears of men to the hearts of women. The city endured because they endured. While other Greek states celebrated art or philosophy, Sparta worshipped endurance. The men died for it. The women kept it alive. Gorgo became the symbol of that endurance. When envoys later tried to bribe her with gold to turn against the Greek cause, she laughed. "The price of a Spartan woman," she said, "is the same as that of her city beyond your reach." Years turned to decades. The world around her changed. The Spartan Empire fell, its armies defeated, its discipline softened by wealth. But Gorgo remained unbroken. When Thebes invaded and the sons of Sparta were crushed at Leuctra, she walked through the aftermath with the same calm she had worn at Thermopylae. The Thebans offered her mercy if she would swear loyalty to them. She refused. "You cannot conquer a people who do not fear death," she told them. "And you cannot enslave a woman who has already lost everything." When she died, there was no grand funeral, no marble monument. The people simply carved her name into the stone near the city gates. Over the centuries, her story faded, buried beneath the ruins of a city that had once believed itself immortal. But legend has a way of breathing through silence. Travelers spoke of a whisper in the wind that moved through the olive trees, a voice reminding them of what Sparta once was, a place where even death was not the enemy, only dishonor. Historians often remember Leonidas, the king who stood against an empire. But those who look deeper see Gorgo, the queen who taught an empire how to stand. Her strength was not forged in battle, but in restraint. Her courage not in defiance, but in endurance. The men of Sparta made legends of their deaths. Gorgo made meaning of their lives. And when the sun sets over the Peloponnesian hills, the shadows of those ancient stones stretch long across the ground. The wind moves softly through the broken columns, carrying a single word in a woman's voice: stand. It is the sound of the last Spartan woman, still guarding the spirit of a city that refused to kneel. The morning of June 11, 1963, began like any other in Saigon. The streets were crowded with bicycles. The scent of incense drifted from small temples, and the air shimmered with heat. At a busy intersection, near the Cambodian embassy, a blue Austin sedan came to a slow stop. From it stepped an old Buddhist monk in orange robes. His name was Thich Quang Duc. He walked with quiet dignity, carrying a small cushion. Behind him followed several other monks and nuns, their hands clasped, their faces solemn. None of the people in the street yet understood that they were about to witness one of the most haunting acts of courage in human history. Vietnam in those years was a nation divided not only by war, but by belief. The government of President Ngo Dinh Diem had persecuted Buddhists for years, banning their flags, closing temples, imprisoning monks. In protest, they had marched peacefully, but the government answered with bullets and arrests. Thich Quang Duc had seen enough suffering to understand that words no longer reached the powerful. Only an act that transcended violence could break the silence. So he chose the path of the Bodhisattva, the one who sacrifices himself so others may awaken. As the monks formed a circle around him, Thich Quang Duc sat cross-legged on the cushion in the middle of the road. One of the younger monks brought a large metal canister and placed it behind him. Duc removed his sandals, folded his hands in prayer, and began to chant softly. The sound was calm, steady, almost tender. Then, without hesitation, the younger monk poured gasoline over his head and body. The crowd gasped. Some began to cry. Duc did not move. He continued to chant, the words flowing like water. When he struck the match, the flame caught instantly, rising in a column of orange and blue. The fire devoured him, but he did not scream. He did not flinch. He sat perfectly still, his body engulfed, his face serene. The only movement was the gentle rhythm of his lips, still reciting a prayer for compassion. The crowd fell silent, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. Even the police, who had come to disperse the protests, froze where they stood. In those few minutes, the entire world stopped. A single man, wrapped in fire, was speaking louder than any army could. When his body finally collapsed, the other monks stepped forward and bowed deeply. They did not cry. They lifted his remains with reverence and placed them in a simple wooden coffin. A journalist named Malcolm Brown took a photograph that would circle the globe. In it, the monk sat in flames, motionless as a statue. The image shocked the world. Presidents, generals, and citizens alike were forced to look. The United States government called it a turning point. Diem called it Nifadness. But those who understood Buddhism knew it for what it was, a message written in fire. Thich Quang Duc's act was not suicide. It was self-sacrifice. In his final letter, he wrote, "Before closing my eyes and moving toward the vision of the Buddha, I respectfully plead to the President to take a mind of compassion toward the people of this nation and implement religious equality." He asked for peace, not power. He asked for understanding, not revenge. The regime ignored his plea, but the people did not. Within months, protests spread across the country, and Diem's rule collapsed. The monk who stood in fire had already changed history. Today, the site of his immolation is marked by a small stone memorial. Tourists pass it without knowing. But those who pause feel something in the air, a stillness, a strange quiet that hums like the echo of prayer. In Hue, the heart of Vietnamese Buddhism, his heart relic, miraculously unburned, rests in a glass case, a symbol of compassion that even fire could not conceal. The Quang Duc never raised a weapon, never struck a blow, yet his act remains one of the most powerful in human memory. He proved that true strength is not in domination, but in surrender, not in hatred, but in oath. He showed the world that to burn for others is not to die, but to illuminate. When the wind blows across the streets of modern Saigon, it carries with it a faint scent of smoke, not destruction, but remembrance. And if you listen closely, beneath the noise of traffic and life, you might hear the whisper of a monk's final chant, steady and calm, a prayer that once set the world on fire. The morning of January 28, 1986, was cold and clear at Cape Canaveral. The ocean glittered under a pale blue sky as thousands gathered to watch history take flight. The Space Shuttle Challenger stood tall on the launch pad, its white hull gleaming in the sunlight. Among the 7 astronauts strapped inside was Krista McAuliffe, a schoolteacher from New Hampshire, chosen to be the first civilian in space. Her dream was to teach lessons from orbit, to show children that curiosity could reach the stars. She smiled as she looked out the small window, unaware that the next minute would turn triumph into tragedy. At 11:38 a.m., the countdown reached zero. The engines ignited with a roar that shook the ground. The shuttle lifted slowly, gracefully, a tower of fire beneath it. In mission control, engineers watched their monitors, faces tense but hopeful. "Challenger, go at throttle up," came the call from Houston. Commander Francis Scobie's voice answered, calm and steady. "Roger, go at throttle up." It was the last transmission they ever made. 73 seconds after liftoff, a small puff of smoke appeared on the right solid rocket booster. It was barely noticeable. Then, a burst of flame, a flash, and the sky bloomed into a terrible white cloud. The shuttle broke apart, vanishing into the air in front of a stunned world. On the ground, families screamed. Teachers clutched their students. In Houston, silence fell. There was no debris large enough to recognize, no parachutes, no survivors. The Challenger was gone. But this story is not about how they died. It's about how they lived and what they said before the sky took them. In the days before the launch, the crew recorded messages for students across America. Krista spoke about courage and learning. "You don't have to be famous to make history," she said. "You just have to care enough to try." Pilot Michael Smith joked that space was the best field trip in the universe. Mission specialist Ellison Onizuka told his daughter to look up at the moon when she missed him, because that's where Daddy's going to be working. They were ordinary people chasing an extraordinary dream, trusting that their hands could touch the future. When the explosion came, their voices were cut off, but their mission was not. Engineers later discovered that the cause was a failed O-ring, a tiny rubber seal hardened by the cold. A part no bigger than a hand had undone a billion-dollar dream. But out of that failure came change, safer designs, stricter protocols, and a renewed respect for the risks of exploration. Every rule written afterward bore their fingerprints. President Reagan spoke to a grieving nation that night. "The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted," he said. "It belongs to the brave." They slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. His words became immortal, but the truest legacy of the Challenger crew lived quietly, in classrooms, in young minds who watched the tragedy unfold and still decided to reach higher. Decades later, a small capsule floats in the Smithsonian, holding personal items recovered from the wreckage. Inside are notebooks, patches, photographs, and a small gold pin, engraved with the word teacher. When you stand before it, you can almost feel the echo of their laughter, their excitement, their hope. It is not sorrow that fills the air, but reverence, because even in failure, they succeeded in showing that curiosity, courage, and wonder are worth every risk. Some say that radio waves never truly die. They travel endlessly through space, growing fainter, but never vanishing. Somewhere, far beyond the reach of our telescopes, the last transmission of the Challenger crew is still moving through the stars, a faint signal, drifting between constellations. Maybe in the vast quiet of the universe, someone will hear it one day. A human voice saying, "Go at throttle up." A voice unafraid, chasing light. And maybe that is what immortality really is. Not the avoidance of death, but the refusal to stop reaching. The Challenger never truly fell. It became what it always aimed to be, a piece of the sky. The year was 1199, and the spring air of Limousin smelled of iron and smoke. Across the rolling hills of France, banners fluttered in the wind, bearing the lions of England. King Richard the Lionheart, the most feared warrior of Christendom, had returned from crusade to fight yet another war, not for God, but for what? The castle of Chalus held a treasure he claimed as his own, and he would not leave without it. But fate, as always, was waiting in the smallest of details, a crossbow. A careless shot, and a nameless knight whose arrow would end a legend. Richard had spent his life chasing glory. He had fought in the Holy Land, defied kings, and carved his name into history with blood and courage. To his men, he was invincible. To his enemies, he was a storm in human form. But years of war had made him careless. At 41, he still rode at the front lines, inspecting siege works as if he were an ordinary soldier. The walls of Chalus were weak, the garrison small, the treasure inside insignificant. It should have been nothing more than a minor campaign. Yet destiny hides in the mundane. As the sun began to set, Richard removed his helmet, laughing as he walked the perimeter of the siege. A single defender stood on the battlements, above a young knight armed with a crossbow. He wore no armor, only a tunic, and beside him hung a frying pan for a shield. Richard saw him and laughed again. "You," he called, "are you guarding your supper or your honor?" The knight didn't answer. He took aim and fired. The bolt struck the king in the left shoulder, just below the collarbone. Richard staggered, then looked down at the wound and smiled faintly. "Ah," he said to those near him, "a fair shot." The surgeons tried to remove the arrow, but infection set in quickly. Within days, the wound festered. The man who had fought in hundreds of battles, who had faced swords, axes, and arrows from the souths of Jerusalem to the forests of France, was undone by a single bolt fired from a wall, by a man whose name history almost forgot. As Richard lay dying in his tent, the young knight was brought before him in chains. Everyone expected vengeance. Instead, the Lionheart looked at him and asked, "Do you know who I am?" The knight nodded. "Yes, my king." "And why did you shoot me?" "Because you were stealing from my lord." Richard laughed, a deep, painful laugh that shook his body. "You are honest," he said, "and for that, I forgive you." He ordered the man released, gave him money for his property, and sent him away unharmed. It was one final act of nobility from a king who had built his life on violence. That night, as fever overtook him, he summoned his men. "Let my heart be buried in Anjou," he said, "and my body in Normandy, for I belong to both." He died soon after, his hand resting on the sword that had made him a legend. But forgiveness, it seems, dies faster than kings. After Richard's death, his captains ignored his final command. They hunted down the young knight, flayed him alive, and hung his body from the wall of Chalus. No one remembered his name. Some said it was Bertrand, others Pierre. All that remained certain was that he had killed a man who was thought unkillable. Centuries later, historians would call it irony that the Lionheart, who had survived the might of Saladin, the case of Cruces and the betrayal of his own family, was felled by a boy with a crossbow and a pan. But the story endures not because of its irony, but because of what it revealed. In that final act of mercy, Richard the Lionheart showed more greatness than in any of his victories. The man who had once ruled through fear died in forgiveness. And the nameless knight, who thought he had killed a king, had instead completed his legend. Today, in the ruins of Chalus, the wind still moves through the broken stones where it happened. Travelers stand before a small plaque that marks the place of Richard's death. It reads only one line: "Here fell the Lionheart." Yet if you listen to the wind long enough, you might hear the echo of his laughter, the laugh of a man who understood that even legends bleed, and that mercy, not might, is the truest crown. The Bolivian jungle was quiet, except for the hum of insecticides and the distant crackle of gunfire. In a small mud brick schoolhouse surrounded by soldiers, a man with a beard and tired eyes sat bound to a wooden chair. His wrists were bruised, his clothes torn, his face hollow from hunger and malaria. His name was Ernesto Che Guevara, doctor, soldier, revolutionary, and legend. Once, he had dreamed of igniting freedom across continents. Now, in a remote valley called La Higuera, he waited for the end. The man who had fought for nations that were not his own was about to die without a country. Years earlier, Che had been a medical student in Argentina, traveling across South America on a motorcycle with his friend Alberto Granado. What he saw changed him forever: children starving in the Andes, lepers abandoned by their families, workers beaten for speaking out. He wrote of it in his diary, calling it the awakening of my eyes. He realized that illness was not only of the body, but of the system that allowed so much suffering. Healing, he decided, required more than medicine. It required revolution. He met Fidel Castro in Mexico in 1955, a young lawyer planning to overthrow the dictator Batista in Cuba. Che joined him, not for glory, but because he saw in Castro a chance to fight for something greater than himself. In the Sierra Maestra Mountains, he proved more than a doctor. He became a leader. His discipline was merciless, his ideals uncompromising. When the revolution triumphed in 1959, Cuba cheered his name. He served as minister, diplomat, and symbol of defiance against imperial power. But power, to him, was a prison. He despised bureaucracy, comfort, and politics. The revolution, he wrote, is not an apple that falls when it is ripe. You have to make it fall. By 1965, he vanished from public life. Rumors swirled. Some said he had died, others that he had gone underground. In truth, he had left Cuba to spread his revolution elsewhere, to Congo, then to Bolivia. He believed one spark could ignite an entire continent. But Bolivia was not ready. His group was small, isolated, hunted by the CIA and Bolivian army. The peasants, frightened by reprisals, refused to join him. Disease and hunger took the rest. One by one, his men were captured or killed until only a few remained. On October 8, 1967, Che was wounded and surrounded in a ravine. He was captured alive. The next morning, soldiers dragged him into the small schoolhouse in La Higuera. He sat calmly, hands bound, speaking softly to the young soldiers guarding him. One of them offered him food. Che refused. "Tell your commander," he said, "that I know I am going to die. Shoot me well. You are killing a man, not an idea." The Bolivian officer hesitated. Orders had come from higher up. Che was too dangerous to live. At 1:10 in the afternoon, Sergeant Mario Terran entered the room, trembling. "I can't shoot," he whispered. "Do it," Che said. "Shoot, coward. You are only going to kill a man." A moment later, gunfire echoed through the valley. They cut off his hands for identification and flew his body to a secret burial site. For 30 years, no one knew where he lay, but the photograph taken after his death, his body on a stretcher, eyes open, hair flowing, made him immortal. Some said he looked like Christ. Others said he looked like justice denied. Whatever they saw, it was enough to turn him into myth. His face, captured in a single black and white image, would circle the world, painted on walls, printed on flags, worn on shirts by people who knew nothing of the man, but everything of the symbol. Che Guevara was not perfect. He was both healer and killer, visionary and zealot. He believed in compassion, but demanded sacrifice. His revolution brought both hope and pain. Yet his story endures because it asks a question that never fades. How far will you go for what you believe in? For Che, the answer was all the way, to the end of the world, to the edge of death, to the silence of a foreign jungle where no anthem would play and no flag would rise. When his remains were finally found in 1997, they were returned to Cuba, buried with honors in Santa Clara, the city he had liberated decades earlier. Thousands came to see his coffin, some in tears, others in silence. Above his tomb, carved in stone, are the words he once wrote to his children. Let me say, at the risk of seeming ridiculous, that the true revolutionary is guided by great feelings of love. Today, his image still watches from murals and mountainsides, eyes fixed on the horizon. For some, he is a saint. For others, a sinner. But for all, he is proof that ideas once set free cannot be captured. The rebel without a country lives on, wherever people still dream of justice in a world that keeps forgetting it. It was December 11, 1936, and snow drifted softly over London. The streets were silent, the radios waiting. Inside Windsor Castle, a man paced the floor, a cigarette trembling between his fingers. His name was Edward VIII, King of the United Kingdom, Emperor of India, ruler of nearly half the world. He had worn the crown for less than a year, and tonight he would give it up. The world had seen kings fall to war, to rebellion, to death, but never to love. Edward had always been different from his predecessors. Charismatic, modern, impatient with the stiffness of royal life, he spoke directly to the people, not through courtiers. They adored him. But in the shadow of Buckingham Palace, tradition weighed heavier than affection. Kings were not supposed to follow their hearts. They were supposed to follow duty. And duty had no room for Wallis Simpson, an American woman, twice divorced, whose laughter made the king forget the burden of his crown. They met at a party in 1931. Wallis was sharp, witty, and fearless. She spoke to him as no one else dared, treating him not as a king, but as a man. By the time his father, King George V, died, Edward's affection for her had become obsession. He introduced her to his family, to his ministers, to his world. But the establishment recoiled. The Church of England forbade the marriage of a monarch to a divorced woman whose ex-husband still lived. The press, silenced by royal pressure, whispered of scandal behind closed doors. Politicians warned him that marrying her would destroy the monarchy itself. The choice was clear: crown or love. For months, Edward tried to find another way. He proposed a morganatic marriage, where Wallis would be his wife, but not queen. The government refused. Every advisor, every ally turned against him. The Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, told him bluntly, "You must choose." On the evening of December 10th, Edward saw signed the instrument of abdication. His younger brother, the shy and stammering Prince Albert, would become King George VI. The next night, Edward addressed his people for the last time. I have found it impossible, he said, his voice steady, but breaking beneath the surface, to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king without the help and support of the woman I slay. It was the first time in history that a monarch had spoken of love to his subjects. Across Britain, people wept. Some called him selfish, others brave. But all understood that something irreversible had happened. The age of duty had bowed just once to the age of the heart. Afterward, Edward became the Duke of Windsor and left England forever. Wallace joined him months later in France, where they were married in a quiet ceremony. No royal family members attended. The couple spent the rest of their lives wandering Europe and America, living in exile, yet never apart. They threw parties, met presidents, and watched from afar, as history moved on without them. During World War II, they were suspected of sympathizing with Germany, their reputations shadowed by rumors and regret. But through it all, they remained together, flawed, loyal, inseparable. When Edward died in 1972, his body was brought back to England. For the first time in decades, the woman for whom he had given up a crown stood again on British soil. She wore black, silent as ever, her gloved hand resting on the coffin. The inscription on his grave read simply, Edward, Duke of Windsor, 1894–1972. No title of king, no symbol of empire. Just a man who made a choice. Wallace lived another 14 years. She was buried beside him, their names carved side by side in stone. Today, their tomb lies in the quiet gardens of Frogmore, not far from the graves of the royals who once shunned them. Tourists visit, whispering the story of the king who gave up the world for love. Some call it romantic, others call it foolish. But perhaps it was neither. Perhaps it was the rarest kind of courage to walk away from power, to live without a crown, to be human. In the end, Edward proved that even kings are not immune to the heart's rebellion. History will always debate whether he was right or wrong. But the echo of his final words still lingers, softer than snow, stronger than time. I found it impossible to carry on without the woman I love. Tokyo, August 1945. The city was a graveyard of ash and steel. Smoke still rose from the ruins left by months of bombing. Japan had lost the war. The emperor was preparing to surrender. Yet in a small underground laboratory beneath the mountains of Nagano, a man continued to work. His name was Masaru Hayashi, an engineer, inventor, and patriot. He was building something he knew would never see the battlefield, something he refused to let fall into enemy hands. As the empire collapsed above him, he chose to destroy his life's work rather than let it be used for destruction again. Masaru had been a child of the Meiji era, born when Japan was racing to modernize. From an early age, he was fascinated by machine steam engines, telegraphs, airplanes. By the time he was 20, he was one of the country's brightest minds in aeronautical engineering. During the war, he was recruited by the Imperial Army to design new propulsion systems. He dreamed not of bombs, but of flight, of using science to connect the world. But in war, dreams are commandeered. His designs for high-efficiency engines were soon repurposed for military aircraft. He watched his work rain fire upon cities he would never see. When Hiroshima and Nagasaki vanished under atomic clouds, Masaru realized the war was truly over, and science had become the servant of annihilation. His laboratory was one of the last still operating, hidden deep within the mountains, protected from American bombers. His team begged him to surrender their research to the occupation forces. The Americans would pay, they said. They would make him rich. But Masaru shook his head. Knowledge, he said, belongs to the world. But this knowledge belongs to death. That night, he walked through the lab. touching the machines he had built with his own hands. There were prototypes of jet engines, turbine blueprints, even early guidance systems technologies that could have changed the future of ovation. He ran his fingers across the metal, cold and perfect, and felt only shimmy. In a small storage room, he found an old katana family heirloom passed down from his samurai ancestors. Its blade was tarnished, but its edge still gleamed in the candlelight. For centuries, his family had lived by a code: serve with honor, die with honor. He realized then that his war was not against a foreign enemy, but against the corruption of his own creation. Masaru called his remaining engineers together. Tonight, he said, we end this. Burn every drawing, every document. Smash the prototypes. Let nothing remain that can be turned into another weapon. Some protested, others wept. But they obeyed. For hours the fires roared inside the tunnels, devouring paper, wood, and metal. Sparks flew like fireflies, as history erased itself. When it was done, Masaru bowed to his men. Go home, he told them. Live. Build something that helps people breathe, not die. They left him there, in the flickering light of the flames. At dawn, the Allied forces arrived. They found the lab still smoldering, the air thick with the smell of oil and ashes. In the center of the room lay Masaru's body, the katana beside him, the blade buried in his chest. On the wall, carved with a chisel, were his final words: science without humanity is a weapon against its maker. The Americans were puzzled. They salvaged what they could, but most of the data was gone. Only fragments survived enough to hint at technologies far ahead of their time. Over the years, whispers spread among engineers and historians of a genius who had destroyed his own inventions to save mankind from itself. Some said his notes inspired early Japanese advances in post-war aviation. Others believed they vanished completely, like his name from official records. Today, in the tunnels beneath Nagano, rusted fragments of his machines still lie buried in dust. Local villagers call him the last samurai engineer, a man who fought not with a sword, but with conscience. His story is told quietly among Japanese scientists as a reminder that progress must serve life, not power. There are no monuments to him, no graves marked with flowers. Only a legend that when the fires consumed his laboratory, they did not destroy his spirit. They purified it. Sometimes, when the wind moves through the mountains at night, the villagers say you can hear the faint clang of metal and the whisper of a voice carried by the smoke. Build something that endures, not in war, but in peace. The morning of August 24th, 79 AD, dawned bright and calm over the Bay of Naples. The streets of Pompeii were alive with the usual bus lavenders shouting, fountains spilling cool water, the smell of bread rising from stone ovens. Above them, Mount Vesuvius loomed as it always had, silent and steady, a mountain the locals believed was blessed by the gods. But deep within, the mountain was breathing, and soon the gods would answer in fire. Among those preparing for the day's rituals was a young priest named Lucius Marcellus, keeper of the temple of Jupiter. By sunset his faith would be tested beyond the limits of flesh and fear. Lucius had been a priest since boyhood. He believed, with all the innocence of his heart, that duty to the gods was duty to Rome itself. Every morning, he bathed the temple altar in oil, recited the sacred hymns, and offered wine to Jupiter, Lord of Thunder. That morning, the sky was unusually still. Birds had vanished. Dogs howled in the streets. A faint noise shook the temple floor. The other priests whispered of bad omens, but Lucius smiled. The earth speaks, he said. Perhaps Jupiter is simply restless. At noon, the mountain exploded. The roar was deafening, as if the heavens themselves had cracked open. A column of ash and flame shot miles into the sky. darkening the sun. Pebbles and ash rained down on the city. Panic swept through the streets. People fled toward the sea, clutching their children, covering their heads with cloth. In the chaos, Lucius ran back to the temple. Inside, statues of the gods lay shattered on the floor. Smoke poured through the open doors. He knelt before the altar, choking, and shouted into the empty air, "Lord Jupiter, protect your city. Spare your people." No answer came, only the sound of thunder and falling stone. Hours passed. The ash grew thicker, the sky blacker. The air burned to breathe. Lucius could have run, could have joined the crowds escaping down the coast, but he refused. His duty, he believed, was to stay. He gathered what few worshippers remained and led them in prayer, their voices rising against the storm. When the roof began to collapse, he ushered the survivors into the cellars beneath the temple. "If the gods see fit to take us," he told them, "let them find us faithful." The second wave came without warning, a surge of superheated gas and ash rolling down the mountain faster than wind. It tore through the city, turning everything in its path to flame and silence. When it reached the temple, Lucius was still standing at the altar, holding the golden chalice in both hands. The heat was unbearable, but he did not move. His final words were a whisper lost to the roar Ave Jupiter. When the city was rediscovered nearly 18 centuries later, archaeologists found the temple buried under 20 feet of ash. Inside, they uncovered the remains of a man standing upright near the altar, his hands clasped around a cup of bronze, used to his bones. The position of his body suggested no struggle, no attempt to flee. He had died where he stood, facing the God he had served all his life. To modernize, it might seem foolish, a man praying to gods who could not give him. But perhaps that is the wrong way to see it. Perhaps Lucius understood something deeper, that faith is not a shield against death, but a way to meet it without fear. He stayed not because he believed the gods would intervene, but because he believed it was his place to bear witness. Today, the ruins of Pompeii lie open under the same sun that once rose over his city. Tourists walk the cobblestone streets, their footsteps echoing between walls that remember screams. In the temple's shadow, the air still feels heavy, as if holding its breath. And in that silence, one can almost see him, still a lone priest, standing in the fire, his faith unburned. Lucius Marcellus left no words, no scripture, no miracle, only a question that outlasted the empire he served. When the sky falls, will you run, or will you stand? The rain fell softly over Manchester in June of 1954, soaking the gray stone of a small English house. Inside, a man sat at his desk surrounded by papers, blueprints, and the faint hum of machinery. His name was Alan Turing, the mathematician who had saved millions, the genius who had defeated the unbreakable code of the Nazis, and the man his own country would destroy for loving the wrong person. On the table beside him sat an apple, untouched, its skin polished to a quiet shine. He looked at it for a moment, smiled faintly, and whispered, "It is finished." 2 decades earlier, during the darkest days of World War II, Turing had walked through the gates of Bletchley Park, a top-secret facility hidden in the English countryside. The air inside buzzed with typewriters and whispered panic. German U-boats were sinking Allied ships faster than they could be replaced. The enemy's messages, encrypted by the Enigma machine, were indecipherable. Every day, thousands of lives vanished into the sea because no one could read the code. Turing believed he could change that. He was awkward, brilliant, impatient with bureaucracy. While others filled notebooks with guesses, Turing built a machine that could think faster than any human. They called it the Bombe, towering device of spinning rotors and wires, designed to test every possible key of the Enigma in minutes. It was not perfect, but it was enough. By 1941, the Allies were reading German communications in real time. Convoys were rerouted, ambushes avoided, invasions planned. Historians would later say that Turing shortened the war by at least 2 years, saving more than 14 million lives. But at the time, his work was a secret known to only a handful of men. After the war, he returned to academia, dreaming of machines that could learn, reason, and evolve. He called it artificial intelligence. The world called it madness. And then, one day, the same government he had served came knocking on his door, not to thank him, but to accuse him. His crime was gross indecency, being a homosexual in a nation where love between men was illegal. In the eyes of the law, his genius meant nothing. They offered him a choice: prison or chemical castration. He chose the latter, believing it would allow him to continue his research. The injections destroyed his body, his mind, his spirit. He kept working, kept writing, even as his hands trembled and his voice cracked. He built one of the earliest programs that could simulate logic, the foundation of what would one day become computer science. But as the years passed, the violence around him grew unbearable. The nation that had once depended on him now pretended he had never existed. On that final day in June, he finished typing a letter to his friend, then carefully arranged his papers. He took the apple, coated with cyanide, and placed it on the table. The story goes that he took one bite and lay down. His body found the next morning by his housekeeper. Whether that part is true or not, no one knows. The apple was never tested. But the symbolism was perfect: a brilliant mind, poisoned by the ignorance of its time. Alan Turing was 41 years old. It would take more than half a century for Britain to acknowledge its crime. In 2009, Prime Minister Gordon Brown issued an official apology. "We're sorry, you deserved so much better." 4 years later, Queen Elizabeth granted him a royal pardon, 60 years too late. But forgiveness is not what he needed. Recognition is not what he sought. All he ever wanted was to live freely, to think without restraint, to love without fear. Today, the machines he dreamed of have become reality. They calculate, learn, and create just as he imagined. Every computer, every algorithm, every spark of artificial intelligence carries a trace of his mind. He once wrote, "We can only see a short distance ahead, but we can see plenty there that needs to be done." He was right. Humanity still struggles to catch up to him. Outside the University of Manchester stands a bronze statue of Alan Turing, sitting on a bench, an apple in his hand. Tourists pass by, sometimes not recognizing the man who gave birth to the modern world. But those who know stop for a moment, stand in the rain, and feel the weight of what Selenius once cost. And when the light hits the statue just right, the bronze apple seems to gleam, like a quiet, eternal apology from a nation to its forgotten savior. The snow fell endlessly over the Kolyma camps, erasing footprints as soon as they were made. The wind howled through the barbed wire, carrying with it the sound of chains and coughing. Somewhere in that frozen wasteland, a man named Osip Mandelstam recited a poem to himself quietly, so the guards wouldn't hear. His lips moved, cracked and bleeding, but the words were perfect. He had no paper, no pen, no audience, only memory. In a place built to erase men, he chose to remember beauty. Osip Mandelstam had once been the voice of a generation. Born in Warsaw in 1891 and raised in St. Petersburg, he lived through the birth of modern Russia. He studied in Paris, read Latin and Greek, and believed poetry was a sacred duty to speak the truth of the soul. When the revolution came, he welcomed it at first. Like many artists, he thought it would bring freedom. Instead, it brought silence. The new regime under Stalin demanded not truth, but obedience. Mandelstam gave neither. In 1933, he wrote a short poem that would seal his fate. It was only 16 lines long, a whisper shared among friends. But in those lines, he described Stalin as a mountain peasant with thick fingers, a man whose fat fingers were like worms. It was a crime not of ink, but of courage. Someone reported him. Within days, secret police came in the night. They searched his apartment, tore up his manuscripts, and dragged him away. His wife Nadezhda could only watch as he disappeared into the machinery of fear. Mandelstam was sent first to internal exile, then to the labor camps. There, men worked until their names were forgotten and their bodies became part of the snow. But even in that desolation, he kept writing. He would compose poems in his head, reciting them over and over until he could teach them to others. Some prisoners memorized them, passing the words from mouth to mouth like contraband fire. Poetry, he once said, is power, not decoration. And in the Gulag, that power was all he had left. His wife never stopped fighting for him. She memorized every poem he dictated during their brief reunions, committing hundreds of lines to memory. My job, she said, was to be his paper. Through her, his voice survived when all else failed. She smuggled his verses out of the camps, copying them by hand in secret. Many of the poems we have today exist because she risked her life to preserve them. Together, they turned love into resistance. By 1938, the conditions in Kolyma had become unbearable. Prisoners starved by the thousands. Mandelstam grew weaker each day, his once bright eyes now hollow. But even as he collapsed in the snow, he whispered lines of verse. His last recorded words were a poem about warmth, about bread, light, and spring. The irony was cruel, but the hope was real. In a world built to crush the human spirit, he died still creating. When the guards buried him in a mass grave, they didn't bother with a marker. They thought they had erased him completely. Yet decades later, his poems would resurface memorized, smuggled, translated. They spread across the world like the thawing of winter. His words, written in secret, outlived the men who had silenced him. Stalin died in his palace. Mandelstam lived in every page that followed. Today, a small monument stands in his honor in Voronezh, where he wrote some of his final works. It is simple, a bronze face half buried in stone, eyes closed, mouth open as if still reciting a poem to the wind. The inscription reads, "I was washed up onto the shore of the century." People leave flowers there, even in winter. The snow covers them, but for a moment, the world feels quiet again, like a pause between verses. The poet of the Gulag, who died nameless and starving, gave humanity a truth too vast for any prison to contain, that words are the last form of freedom. And when the northern wind blows across those frozen plains, it carries with it a faint whisper, a line that refuses to defy. I will not live long enough to see spring, but someone will, and they will remember. The city of Alexandria once shimmered like a dream on the edge of the Mediterranean. Its great library housed the wisdom of the world. Its scholars mapped the heavens, and its philosophers debated the meaning of existence beneath marble colonnades. But by the 5th century, that light was fading. The old gods were dying, replaced by a faith that saw questions as threats. And in the middle of this storm stood a woman named Hypatia, mathematician, astronomer, philosopher, and the last guardian of the ancient world. Hypatia was born around 360 AD, the daughter of Theon, a renowned scholar at the Library of Alexandria. From him, she inherited both genius and conviction. She studied the stars, the movements of planets, the logic of numbers. She walked through the halls of the library with scrolls in her arms and the sun in her mind. While most women were expected to remain silent, Hypatia lectured openly to students, drawing crowds of both pagans and Christians. Her words were measured, her intellect disarming. She believed truth was not a matter of faith, but of reason. Reserve your right to think, she told her students. Even to think wrongly is better than not to think at all. At first the city adored her. Governors and bishops sought her counsel. She became a symbol of Alexandria's golden intellect, a bridge between the old and the new. But in an age of fear, brilliance can look like rebellion. The Christian Church, now rising to power, saw her as dangerous. To them, she represented everything they were trying to bury: curiosity, independence, and the old pagan ways. When riots broke out between rival religious factions, they accused her of witchcraft, of corrupting minds with forbidden knowledge. In the year 415, on a spring afternoon, Hypatia left her home to travel to the library. The streets were tense. Whispers followed her. A mob of zealots, fueled by rumor and hatred, surrounded her chariot. They dragged her into a nearby church, the very house of God turned into a chamber of horror. There, they stripped her of her robes, tore her body apart with shards of pottery, and burned what remained. Her students, powerless to save her, fled into the desert. The library was plundered soon after, its scrolls scattered to the wind. The flame of ancient knowledge went out with her last breath. But destruction has a strange way of creating immortality. Hypatia's name, though meant to be erased, survived in the whispers of those she taught. Generations later, her story was retold by philosophers, historians, and poets. She became a martyr not for religion, but for reason, a symbol of thought, in defiance of fear. In her, the world saw the cost of ignorance and the price of enlightenment. She was not just the last scholar of Alexandria. She was the first scientist of a new era. Centuries passed, and her legend grew. Renaissance thinkers invoked her as the muse of mathematics. Enlightenment writers hailed her as a martyr of free inquiry, and modern scientists honor her as a pioneer who dared to ask questions when the world demanded silence. The men who killed her are forgotten. The church that condemned her has changed beyond recognition. But Hypatia endures, an eternal figure, standing between darkness and dawn. Today, in Alexandria, a statue rises near the sea. It depicts a woman gazing upward, her hands outstretched to the stars she once studied. Around her, the city hums with life, its streets filled with the noise of traffic and voices. Few who pass remember her name. But those who stop, even for a moment, can feel the gravity of her story. In a world that still struggles between belief and reason, she remains a reminder of both the danger and necessity of truth. They say that when the night sky is clear over Egypt, you can see the same constellations Hypatia mapped 16 centuries ago. The stars are unchanged, though empires have fallen and gods forgotten. Somewhere in that infinite silence, her voice still echoes, a calm defiance carried across time. Think. The year was 1431, and the chill of early morning hung heavy over Rouen, France. In the courtyard of a gray stone fortress, a wooden stake stood waiting, surrounded by bundles of straw. Soldiers formed a circle, priests whispered prayers, and townspeople gathered in silence. In the center of it all, a young woman in a white robe walked calmly toward the pyre. Her name was Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc, the girl who had once led armies, crowned a king, and defied an empire. Now she was 19 years old, barefoot, shackled, and soiling. Only a few years earlier, Joan had been a peasant girl from the small village of Domremy. She could neither read nor write. Yet at 13 she began hearing voices. She said they were saints, urging her to drive the English out of France and restore her homeland's freedom. It was madness to everyone but her. And somehow, through the sheer force of conviction, that madness became destiny. She cut her hair, donned armor, and rode at the head of armies. Soldiers twice her age followed her. not because she was a warrior, but because she believed with a purity they had forgotten. In 1429, she led French forces to victory at Orléans, a triumph that turned the tide of the Hundred Years' War. Her courage became legend, her faith unshakable. When she entered battle, she carried not a sword but a banner, embroidered with the words Jesus Mary. Her presence transformed cowards into heroes. She claimed she felt no fear, only purpose. Within months, she guided the Dauphin, Charles, to Reims, where he was crowned king. It should have been the beginning of France's rebirth. Instead, it was the beginning of her end. Politics moves faster than miracles. Once Charles was crowned, he no longer needed the girl who spoke with angels. When Joan was captured by the Burgundians, French allies of the English, he did nothing to ransom her. She was sold to her enemies for 10,000 francs, less than the price of a good horse. The English wanted not just her body, but her soul. If they could prove she was a heretic, they could destroy her cause. Her trial was a spectacle of cruelty disguised as law. Dozens of bishops and inquisitors questioned her for months, twisting her words, mocking her visions. "Do you think God speaks to you?" they asked. "Yes," she replied. "And he speaks to you too. You just do not listen." They called her arrogant, witch, liar, soldier of the devil. But Joan never broke. When they demanded she deny the voices that had guided her, she refused. "Even if you tear me apart limb by limb," she said, "I will not deny what I have seen." On May 30th, she was sentenced to death by fire. That morning she asked for a cross. A sympathetic guard fashioned one from 2 sticks and handed it to her. She kissed it and held it tightly as they led her through the streets. When she reached the stake, she asked that another cross be held high before her, so she could see it as the flames rose. The priest obliged. As the executioner lit the fire, she began to pray aloud. Her voice did not waver. The flames climbed. Smoke filled the air. Witnesses said she cried out the name of Jesus again and again until her voice became a whisper. Then silence. When the fear died, the executioner raked through the ashes, expecting to find only bone. Instead, he found her heart, untouched by the flames. Terrified, he fled the city. The people began to murmur that the girl who burned had not been destroyed, but sanctified. Decades later, the same church that condemned her declared her innocent. Centuries later, she was canonized as a saint. Today, her statue stands in cathedrals and city squares across France, her armor gleaming, her gaze lifted toward heaven. But the truest image of her is not the warrior on horseback or the saint in marble. It is the young woman in white, standing at dawn, smiling at the fire. Joan of Arc died with no army, no crown, no earthly victory. Yet her faith outlived empires. Her courage was not in her victories, but in her acceptance of loss. She believed that obedience to conscience was worth dying for, even when the world called her a fool. And perhaps that is why, when the flames rose, she smiled. Not because she was unafraid, but because she knew that truth, once lit, cannot be extinguished. When the bells of Rouen ring in the early morning, the sound drifts through the same air she breathed. Some say that if you stand in the square at dawn and close your eyes, you can feel a warmth not of fire, but of faith and the whisper of a girl's voice carried on the wind. The light will never die. The night of April 14th, 1912, was so still that the Atlantic looked like glass. Above it, a canopy of stars stretched from one horizon to the other, glittering over the most luxurious ship ever built. The RMS Titanic cut through the calm sea at 22 knots, her decks glowing with electric light, her passengers dancing, dining, dreaming. On the bridge stood Captain Edward John Smith, 52 years old, a man with a white beard and steady eyes. He had commanded ships for nearly 40 years and was known among sailors as the millionaire's captain. This was to be his final voyage before retirement. He would never see land again. At 11:40 p.m., the message came from the crow's nest shape ahead, dark and massive. Iceberg right ahead. The warning bell clanged 3 times. First Officer Murdoch shouted orders, hard a starboard, full astern. The great ship shuddered as it turned, missing the iceberg by feet. But beneath the surface, the fatal scrape had already come. Ice tore open the hull along 300 feet of steel. 5 compartments flooded within seconds. The Titanic was doomed. When the impact came, most passengers barely noticed. The ship seemed unshakable. In the first-class lounge, a few glasses rattled. In the boiler rooms, men felt the sea rush in like knives. Captain Smith arrived on the bridge moments later. "What have we struck?" he asked. Murdoch's face was pale. "An iceberg, sir. We've stopped the engines." Smith sent for the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, who examined the damage, then looked up with keen horror. "She'll sink," he said. "It's a mathematical certainty." Smith blinked, his face unreadable. "How long?" Andrews hesitated. "An hour, maybe 2. There was no panic, not yet." Smith ordered the lifeboats uncovered, distress rockets fired, and the crew to muster the passengers. The Titanic carried more than 2,200 souls, but lifeboats for barely half. The air was bitterly cold, the sea black as ink. Women and children were loaded first. Many refused to leave, certain the great ship could not sink. Smith walked among them calmly, reassuring, his voice steady. "Ladies, you must go now," he said. "It's only a precaution." As the minutes passed, the angle of the deck began to tilt. Still, the orchestra played. Smith moved from boat to boat, helping to load the frightened and the stubborn alike. He gave no speeches, no orders for glory, only quiet instructions. When someone asked where he would go, he shook his head. "I will stay," he said simply. "I have no business with a lifeboat." Shortly after 2 a.m., the last boats were gone. The ship's bow had already disappeared beneath the waves. The stern rose into the air, the lights flickering, then failing one by one. In the chaos that followed, the screams, the freezing spray, the black water, Captain Smith was seen for the last time near the wheelhouse. Some said he entered it and closed the door. Others swore they saw him diving into the sea to help a child. No one knows for sure. What is certain is that when the Titanic broke in two and slid beneath the Atlantic, her captain went with her. When rescue ships arrived hours later, the ocean was littered with debris, deck chairs, timbers, lifebelts, and bodies floating in silence. The sun rose over a world forever changed. More than 1,500 people were gone. But those who survived remembered one thing clearly: the calm of a man who never raised his voice, who never ran, who chose duty over life. In the years that followed, Captain Smith became a symbol of the old code of the sea's unwritten law that the captain goes down with his ship. Some called it foolish, others noble. But for Smith, it was neither. It was simply right. A ship, he once told a friend, is a living thing. The captain is its soul. If the ship dies, so does he. Today, a statue of him stands in Lichfield, England. The inscription reads, "Be British," not a command to fight, but to stand firm, to face the inevitable with dignity. The ocean still covers his grave, 2 miles deep, cold and endless. But sometimes, when ships pass over the coordinates where the Titanic sank, sailors say the sea grows strangely still. The wind softens. The water seems to hold its breath. And for a brief moment, it feels as though the captain is there again, standing on the bridge, eyes toward the horizon, waiting for dawn that will never come. It was October 27th, 1962, and the world was seconds away from ending. In the waters off Cuba, an American destroyer dropped depth charges on a Soviet submarine. Above the waves, no one knew that the submarine carried a nuclear torpedo. Below, in the suffocating darkness, men gasped for air as the temperature climbed past 100 degrees. The lights flickered. The oxygen was nearly gone, and panic spread through the crew. In the control room stood one man who could decide the fate of the planet, Vasily Arkhipov, second in command of the Soviet fleet. One word from him, and the Cold War would become the last war. The world above was already on the edge. For 2 weeks, the United States and the Soviet Union had faced each other in a deadly standoff over nuclear missiles in Cuba. President Kennedy's forces had surrounded the island, demanding that Khrushchev withdraw his weapons. The Soviets refused. Every hour, the tension grew. Then came the order for the Americans to drop warning depth charges on the Soviet submarines lurking nearby to force them to surface. It was meant as intimidation. But inside one of those submarines, B-59, the crew believed the war had already begun. Cut off from radio contact, exhausted and half-mad from heat, they thought the explosions above were signs that the United States had attacked. The captain, Valentin Savitsky, slammed his fist on the console. "We will not disgrace our Navy," he shouted. "We will die, but we will sink them all first." The submarine carried one nuclear torpedo wound blast capable of igniting World War III. To launch, the captain needed the agreement of all 3 senior officers aboard. One had already said yes. The other, Vasily Arkhipov, had not. Arkhipov was no stranger to chaos. A year earlier, he had been aboard another submarine that nearly melted down after a reactor accident. He had seen men die from radiation, had seen courage and madness blur together. Now, as the crew begged for action, he stayed silent. The captain turned to him, sweat running down his face. "Comrade Commander," he demanded, "what are you waiting for? They are attacking us." Arkhipov looked at him, then at the map on the table. "If we launch," he said quietly, "we start a war we cannot finish." The crew stared. The captain shouted again, veins bulging in his neck. Arkhipov raised his voice for the first time. "You are wrong," he said. "We are not dying heroes. We are dying fools if we fire that weapon." His authority as flotilla commander gave him the final say. The silence in the room stretched like wire. Then slowly the captain lowered his hand. The order to launch was canceled. The submarine surfaced, surrendering to the American ships above. The world did not end that day. When they returned to the Soviet Union, the crew was not celebrated. They were reprimanded for giving away their position, for surfacing in front of the enemy. No one outside a handful of officials knew what Arkhipov had done. He went back to work, lived quietly, and never spoke publicly about that day. He retired with the rank of vice admiral, his heroism buried under secrecy. He died in 1998, largely unknown, his name missing from the history books. It wasn't until decades later, after Soviet records were declassified, that the full story emerged. Historians realized that his single act of restraint, this refusal to turn fear into farce, had likely prevented nuclear war. A moment of calm in one man's mind had saved billions of lives. In 2002, the United Nations honored him posthumously, calling him the man who prevented World War III. His widow said simply, "Vasily was always calm. He just didn't want to start a war." Today, his story is taught in military academies as a lesson in discipline and humanity. It is a reminder that the power to destroy the world often rests not in governments, but in individuals faced with impossible choices. Arkhipov never raised a weapon, never gave a speech, never sought glory. He just said no, and the planet kept spinning. When the wind moves across the surface of the Caribbean, The sea seems calm, but beneath it once lurked a decision that could have burned the sky, and somewhere in that stillness you can almost hear the echo of a quiet voice saying, "Stand down." It is the sound of reason, of mercy, of a single man saving everyone who would never know his name. The morning sun rose over Okinawa in May of 1945, casting light on a battlefield that looked more like the end of the world. Smoke drifted through shattered trees, the air thick with gunfire and fear. On a high ridge overlooking the chaos, a single man stood without a weapon. His name was Desmond Doss, a medic in the U.S. Army's 77th Infantry Division. Around his neck hung not G tags or grenades, but a Bible. He had promised God he would never touch a gun, and now, in the bloodiest battle of the Pacific, he was about to prove that conviction can be stronger than steel. Desmond Doss had been raised in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, a devout Seventh-day Adventist who took the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," as absolute. When the war began, he could have stayed home. Instead, he enlisted not to take life, but to save it. From the moment he arrived at basic training, his beliefs made him an outcast. His fellow soldiers mocked him, beat him, called him a coward. His commanding officer tried to have him discharged on mental grounds, but Doss refused to leave. "While everyone else is taking lives," he said, "I'll be putting them back together." When his unit landed on Okinawa, they faced an impossible mission: capture the Maeda Escarpment, a sheer cliff nicknamed Hacksaw Ridge. The Japanese had turned it into a fortress. The first assault ended in slaughter. Bullets tore through the air, mortars shook the ground, and men screamed for medics. As the survivors retreated down the cliff, Doss stayed behind. Unarmed, surrounded by enemies, he crawled through the mud, dragging the wounded one by one to the edge and lowering them down on ropes. Every time he sent a man to safety, he whispered the same prayer: "Lord, help me get one more." For 12 hours he worked in the darkness, ignoring the pain of his own wounds. Enemy soldiers searched the ridge, their flashlights cutting through the smoke. Doss hid among the dead, moving only when the light passed. By dawn, he had rescued 75 men, friend and foe alike. Some had called him a coward. That day, they called him a miracle. When his superiors asked how he had done it, he just shrugged. "I figured I was the only one who could, so I had to try." The next day he went back up the ridge. During another attack, he was struck by a grenade, shattering his leg. Still, he treated his own wounds and crawled 300 yards to safety, refusing evacuation until others were helped first. When medics finally carried him off the field, he insisted they bring his Bible too. "I can't leave it behind," he said. "It's what kept me alive." Desmond Doss became the first conscientious objector to receive the Medal of Honor. President Harry Truman pinned it to his chest in 1945, saying, "I'm proud of you, son. You really deserve this. I consider this a greater honor than being president." Doss simply nodded, humble as always. He went home to a quiet life, working as a carpenter, never seeking fame. When Hollywood asked to make a movie about him, he refused for decades. "I didn't do it to be remembered," he said. "I just didn't want to leave any mercies behind." He lived to be 87, dying peacefully in 2006. At his funeral, soldiers stood in silence as his coffin passed. Draped in the American flag, he had once refused to carry a weapon to defend. They saluted, not the fighter, but the healer. Today, the ridge still stands, covered in grass and wildflowers. The scars of war remain, but so does his legacy. Every medic, every soldier who risked their life to save others, carries a piece of his spirit. Desmond Doss proved that courage has many faces, and sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is refuse to pull the trigger. They say that when the wind moves over the cliffs of Okinawa at dusk, you can still hear his voice, faint but steady, carried on the sea breeze. One more, Lord, just one more. The sun dipped low over the wheat fields of southern France, spilling gold across the earth. In a small room at the edge of a quiet village, a man sat before an easel, brush trembling in his hand. His name was Vincent van Gogh. Around him, the air smelled of turpentine and madness. On the canvas bloomed a swirl of yellow and blue light, and shadow wrestling in color. Outside, the world called him insane. Inside, he was trying to paint eternity. Vincent had come to Arles in 1888, searching for peace. He dreamed of building a community for artists, a studio of the South, where beauty and friendship could heal the loneliness that haunted him. He wrote hundreds of letters to his brother Theo, each one filled with hope and desperation. I feel, he once wrote, that there is nothing more truly artistic than to love people. But love had not loved him back. The world saw a failure man who couldn't sell a painting, couldn't keep a job, couldn't hold his own mind together. To Vincent, art was both cure and curse. He worked like a man possessed. The yellow sun of Provence became his god, the swirling fields his cathedral. He painted every day, often until his hands bled. When others saw chaos, he saw order hidden in movement. He painted not what was there, but what he felt madness translated into light. Yet loneliness clung to him like dust. His friendship with the painter Paul Gauguin, once his greatest hope, collapsed into violence. After a brutal argument, Vincent sliced off his own ear and delivered it to a woman at a brothel, saying only, "Keep this for remembrance." The world laughed. The newspapers called him a lunatic. He was locked away in the asylum at Saint-Remy, surrounded by white walls and silence. But even there, his vision burned. He painted cypress trees that reached for the heavens, olive groves that shimmered with invisible wind, and a night sky alive with motion. Starry Night was not just a painting. It was a scream turned into beauty. He looked out the barred window, saw the chaos in his mind reflected in the skylight, and gave it form. "The sight of stars," he wrote, "always makes me dream." In July of 1890, he moved to Auvers-sur-Oise, under the care of a kind doctor who admired his art. For a brief moment, he seemed calm. He painted wheat fields and clouds, the pulse of life itself. But beneath that calm, despair waited. He worried about Theo, who was struggling financially. He feared his illness would never release him. On July 27th, Vincent walked into the fields with a pistol. The sound of the shot echoed once, then faded into the summer air. He didn't die immediately. He stumbled back to his small room, clutching his chest, and lay down on his bed. When Theo arrived, Vincent was still conscious. His brother knelt beside him, tears streaming. Vincent smiled faintly. "The sadness will last forever," he whispered. 2 days later, he was gone. He died poor, unknown, his paintings stacked in a corner. In life, he had sold only one canvas. But time, like light, reveals what darkness hides. After his death, his art exploded across the world. People who had once called him mad now called him a genius. His colors became the language of emotion itself. Every stroke, once a wound, became a hymn. Today, his paintings hang in the greatest museums on earth. Millions stand before them, speechless, feeling something they can't explain, a pulse, a warmth, a reflection of themselves. His self-portraits stare back, not with madness, but with understanding. He once wrote, "I dream my painting, and then I paint my dream." He did both, and in doing so, turned pain into light. In Arles, the fields still glow, the same golden hue he once captured. When the wind rustles through the wheat, it sounds almost like a whisper. the echo of a man who saw beauty in the unbearable. Vincent van Gogh never painted fire, but everything he touched burned with it. And somewhere beyond those same stars he pointed, perhaps he finally found peace. The wind moved across the empty city like a sigh. Windows rattled in towers long abandoned, and dust drifted through the streets where no footsteps remained. The billboards still glowed faintly, powered by forgotten solar grids. They lit up faces that no longer existed, smiling families, promises of forever. Above it all, the sun rose without ceremony, shining on a world that no longer needed its warmth. On the roof of an old observatory, a man stood alone, watching the horizon. His name was Elias. He was the last human on Earth. He didn't know exactly when humanity had ended. There had been years of warning rising seas, collapsing systems, whispers of war and disease. Then came silence. The networks went dark one by one. Cities flickered out, and voices vanished into static. He had been an astronomer before everything fell apart, a watcher of stars. Now, he watched the ruins of his own species. Some nights, he still caught himself listening for sounds that would never come, a car engine, a laugh, a heartbeat not his own. His observatory had become both shelter and shrine. Inside were the remnants of civilization, shelves of books, jars of preserved food, a telescope pointed at the sky. On the walls hung faded photos, his wife, his daughter, a team of scientists smiling under a pale blue sky that had since turned gray. Each morning, he climbed the stairs to the roof and spoke into a radio that hadn't answered in years. "This is Elias, Station 19, he would say. "If anyone's out there, please respond." Then he would wait, listening to the crackle of static, as if the universe might change its mind. He spent his days maintaining the solar panels, cataloging constellations, recording the weather, a ritual of order in a world of decay. He told himself it mattered, that someone might find his notes someday, that knowledge itself was worth preserving. But as the years passed, he began to realize he was no longer writing for the future. He was writing to keep from forgetting what it felt like to exist. At night, he watched the stars. Without cities, the sky was clearer than it had been in centuries. The Milky Way stretched like a river of fire across the darkness. Sometimes he imagined he could see the ghosts of satellites drifting overhead, relics of a time when humanity believed it would conquer the heavens. "We always looked up," he whispered. "Maybe that's why we fell." One night, the radio crackled. It was faint, just a hum at first. Then words. "Elias, is that you?" His heart stopped. He stared at the machine, hands shaking. "Yes," he said, "yes, I'm here." The voice was soft, distant. "You're not alone." Then silence. He waited for hours, calling back again and again, but no reply came. The next morning, he searched every frequency, every signal, but heard nothing more. Perhaps it had been a dream, or the radio catching its own echo. Still, he kept listening. As time stretched on, his body began to fail. His hair turned white, his hands trembled, but his mind remained sharp. He no longer feared death. He feared forgetting the world before it ended. So he began to record one final message. He spoke into the microphone, his voice steady but soft. "To whoever finds this, if anyone ever does, know that we were here. We loved, we built, we reached for the stars. We failed in many ways, but we also dreamed. And maybe that dream is enough." He paused, looking out over the silent city. The sun was setting, painting the ruins in gold. "If this is the end," he said, "then let it be beautiful." He turned off the recorder and climbed the stairs one last time to the roof. The air was cold, the sky ablaze with stars. He lay back against the concrete, closed his eyes, and smiled. When morning came, the wind moved gently across the observatory. The radio light blinked once, then twice, then fell still. The sun rose again over the empty earth, touching the telescope that pointed toward infinity. In its lens, a single bright object shimmered, a distant planet, blue and alive, circling another sun. Somewhere far away, a signal traveled through the dark, carrying his voice into the endless night. "This is Elias," it said. "We were here." And the universe, vast and silent, listened.